All right. We've been talking a lot about Moses, and we've been using that to teach some of the lessons. So we're going to back up just a little bit tonight. As the book of Exodus gets started, Joseph has actually passed away. He passed away at the age of 110 years old. And, he was second only to the Pharaoh. You guys probably remember the story of Joseph. If not, later down the road, we're going to be doing a session on Joseph and David so that you can kind of learn from their lives and some of the things that they went through. But anyway, he was second in command only to the Pharaoh, and he brought his dad and his family all to Egypt so that they could live there. They had been nomadic up to that point. They were moving around, and so he brought them into Egypt. Years pass. Joseph dies at the age of 110 years old, and a new king who doesn't know Joseph or doesn't care begins to get worried because the number of slaves has gotten so large. So he makes them slaves. The number of Hebrews has gotten so large that he decides to make them slaves. So he makes them slaves to try to suppress them. In other places the Bible says the more he tried to suppress them, the more they grew as a nation. So we're about 25 years before Moses is born. Joseph has been dead, we're guessing probably a generation, because we know when he lived and when he died. We don't know exactly how long it takes for the new Pharaoh to forget all about Joseph and begin to be nervous about these Hebrews and start putting them under oppression. Okay? But we do know that the 70 members of Jacob's family, Jacob was Joseph's daddy, and their slaves and whoever came with them into Egypt is now numbering in the millions, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. The Pharaoh is getting nervous. And the reason is, Egypt is the world power at that time. But when you've got 3 million people of one ethnicity, the Hebrews, that are that large, that are living inside your borders, that gets to be a little bit of a scary situation. Because what happens if the Midianites come into the Delta, and they begin to attack Egypt again, which they did periodically through the years, and Egypt would fight them back, and they'd have peace treaties and all this other stuff. So let's just say that these Hebrews that you've been mistreating as slaves to try to suppress them, and they continue to grow, don't like you very much because you've made them slaves, and the Midianites come in to attack you, and the next thing you know, you've got 3 million of your own people in your own country helping fight against you. So the Pharaoh doesn't like this situation at all. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't even know where these Hebrews came from. So he starts killing all the Hebrew baby boys. Okay? We know that is cruel, and it is. It wasn't that unheard of in those times. When you took over a country, you would oftentimes kill or castrate all the males so that they could not help overthrow your government. So what he's saying is, I'm not going to go through and kill the Hebrews. What I am going to do is stop their growth. So I'm going to start killing all of the male babies. Okay? Now, that part actually happened just before Moses was born. That's the reason he has his brother Aaron, that is his mouthpiece. We talked about Moses told God, he said, I'm really not good with public speaking, and I'm not really good with talking to the king and that kind of thing, which I don't know how true that was and how much of a cop-out that was, because he was a regal leader in Egypt, and we still have, although they have tried to erase his name from Egyptian, after he killed a Hebrew and fled, they went through and tried to wipe his name out, which they did. If somebody really screwed up, they would just wipe your name off of all the monuments, and they just literally go and scratch it off. But they didn't get all of it, and we know that his name was Sinmut. We know that he was a general. He was a very high-ranking military officer, Moses was. But prior to that, he says, I need somebody to speak for me, and God sends his brother Aaron. Well, how do you have a brother if the Pharaoh's killing all the baby boys? Okay, it was because that the edict to kill the baby boys happened really not too long before Moses was born. So he has a brother and a sister. Okay, Miriam will end up playing a big part in this story. So Moses has a mama. Her name was Jochebed, and he has a daddy named Amram. And they have this baby boy, and they have it in secret. I don't know how this all works. I don't know if she was pregnant before the Pharaoh said, I'm going to kill all the baby boys, or if it wasn't planned, or I don't know. But whatever happened, she's got a baby boy, and she ain't about to just let the Hebrews or the Egyptians come in and kill him. So she tries to hide him. Now, all of this is quite an honor to Jochebed. If you think about being a slave and having to work every day as a slave and making bricks and all of that stuff, and now you've got to, on top of all of that, you've got to hide the fact that you're pregnant. And you're not allowed to use the pregnancy as an excuse to get out of work, because then they'll know that you're pregnant, and they'll begin to watch you. She not only does that, she has the baby without the use of midwives. There were midwives at that time too, and the king had already commanded the midwives to kill the baby boys, and the midwives wouldn't do it. So then that's when the king said, or the Pharaoh says, okay, to his soldiers and whatever, you find one, you kill it, you throw it in the Nile, because the midwives aren't doing it. She has the baby without the midwife, evidently. Okay, goes back to work and somehow keeps this baby for 3 months under covers, under wraps. Nobody knows that she's got it. Okay, none of the Egyptians do. That's kind of a story in and of itself about the tenacity of a mama protecting her baby. The fact that you can keep a 3-year-old from crying and making noise, and how she could keep that from the Egyptians. But anyhow, she does. This is Moses. Okay? So then she decides she has a plan. Now the Bible doesn't talk about it being a plan. It just kind of flatly says this is what she did. She made a basket, she put tar and pitch in it so that it would be waterproof, and she laid the baby in it, and she put it in the bulrushes in the Nile, or in one of the tributaries, and she let Miriam, her daughter, watch it. Okay? That's all we know. I think that probably she knew where the little princess came to bathe, and I think that she knew that she could no longer keep the baby, and every time he cried, she cringed. She was afraid that it was going to get killed. She knew that she couldn't just keep up this charade, or the baby was going to die. I think she floated that baby in a basket at a particular place in the river, hoping that the little princess would find it. That's what I think. That's not in the scriptures. We don't know, so that's just John Hart's opinion. You can take that for what it's worth. And last time I checked, it wasn't worth much. Now, we talked about Thutmose, the third being in power when Moses delivered the people 80 years later after this. But this is 80 years prior to him delivering the people. So Thutmose the first is now the Pharaoh. And he only had one daughter that would be considered the princess, because he had one queen, and her name was Amus. And he had other concubines. So they would be secondary wives. Now he had sons by them, but he had no son by Amus. He only had one daughter, and her name was Hatshepsut. It's Egyptian. I don't know where they come up with these names. Maybe they called her Hattie. I don't know. But Hatshepsut, we know, was her name. At this point in life, she was, believe it or not, see, I always think about the princess coming down, the Pharaoh's daughter coming down, being a young adult, anywhere from 18 to 23, and she sees the baby and, I'll take it to be my own, that kind of thing. That's not the case. Based on what we're seeing archaeologically and that kind of thing, knowing when, Joseph died knowing when Moses was born, knowing when Hatshepsut was born and so forth. She would have only been 7. Maybe 6.5, 7, based on when her birthday was. This is a 7-year-old girl who is under the guard of all the girls that have been assigned to her by the Pharaoh to go down to the river. Well, she didn't go anywhere without an entourage. Okay, for one, she was the Pharaoh's daughter. 2, she was his only child by his queen. And the neighboring countries would all love to kidnap her and use her for ransom, so she is highly guarded. Okay, evidently Moses' mama knew this, knew where she was going to come down to the river, knew what her favorite spot was. She puts Moses in a basket and floats him in that area. I mean, because think about it, common sense says that Moses' mama didn't just say, "Hey, I got an idea. He's crying a lot. Let's put him in a basket and float him down the Nile and see what happens." Okay, probably not. Okay, so, and Miriam's watching him. So he's not really like, floating down the river. And she's like running down the bank trying to keep up with him. She put him in an area where he's going to be relatively stable. This little princess, Hatshepsut, comes and finds him, and she has no brother. And she falls in love with him, probably like most 7-year-olds would fall in love with a baby doll. Okay? And she ain't gonna let anything happen to this little kid. Miriam now, who's hiding off the edge of the river, sees her find the baby, find her brother Moses, and then runs up and says, runs up. You don't run up to an entourage like that. She went to the entourage and said, "Can I offer a suggestion? I see that you have a little Hebrew baby. Would you like for me to find you a mother, because he's not weaned yet?" Well, yeah, obviously a 7-year-old can't breastfeed a little baby, so and none of her people probably could either. So she said, absolutely, that would be a great idea. So Miriam then goes and gets her mama. So they make a deal, and the princess does not know, Hatshepsut does not know that Miriam is actually going to get the baby's mama. Okay, because she could have been killed for having a baby and not letting them know. All right. All of this puts us into a situation where Moses then is raised by his own mama, his own Hebrew mama, with all of the Hebrew background and all of the Hebrew Bible lessons and the Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, until he's about 3 years old. And then she takes him back to the princess, who at that time is now 10 years old, and he becomes her, she says son, basically her brother. Okay? So he's had these very formidable years of his life, the first 3 years of his life, knowing who he is. He's taught Hebrews. He's taught about God. His mama has already started to ingrain in him the importance of his God. And now he goes into Egypt to be part of the training that only was done for the children of the highest officials. Okay, so now he's in this royal school. So I believe, with all of that in mind, and I say all that to give you some background. I want this story to be real to you. I don't want you just blow past this. I want you to understand some of the background, the history to this. And then we look at something in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. And I realize that the letters are a little bit small because we're not going to dwell on this. We're just going to kind of look at this quickly. But it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Okay? So I believe that Moses knew as he was growing up. Now he lived 40 years in Egypt. Okay? Excuse me. He lived 37 years in Egypt, because the first 3 he was with his mama. Getting a basis, I think a good, as biblical basis as you can get for a 3-year-old. But he knew enough to know who he was and where he came from. And then Hebrews is saying that he refused to be called the son of the queen. He wasn't ashamed of who he was. He knew that he was a Hebrew. And I believe that Moses knew that God had a plan for him. I believe that Moses knew that he didn't know what it was, but he knew that God had something for him. He knew that he was saved specially for a purpose. And I believe that there's some of you in here that believe you won't say this because you're afraid it won't come true. You might have never told this to anybody because you don't want to seem arrogant. But there's some of you in here that believe that God has His hand on your life. Some of you might have even been prophesied over. My son has been prophesied over on at least 3 occasions where people meet him and they get to know him when he was younger, when he was a teenager and that kind of thing. And not even really knowing him, not ever really knowing that anybody else has ever said anything, they say, God's got His hand on him. He's going to be something special for God someday. Different people have said that. Some people have said that over you. Maybe your parents said that over you and you discount it because it's coming from your parents. I believe that Moses knew that God had a plan, a special plan for him. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know what to do about it. You don't know what to do about it. You would love for God to use you in some special way, some mighty way, but you don't know what that even looks like. I think that's where Moses was at. So he's 40 years old. Now, because of that, you can kind of get in Moses' head a little bit, right? So by 40 years old, nothing's happening. Okay, I kind of feel like I'm supposed to be something special. I feel like God's got a plan for me. I've already turned down the regency. I've already turned down the chance to be Thutmosis III. And if we go back in history, and I really decided not to bore you with this because although it's completely fascinating to me, I don't think that it's quite as fascinating to you guys. He had the opportunity, being that he was Hatshepsut's son / brother, he had the opportunity to be Thutmosis III. He turned it down. Sinmut was his regal name, and he was given like a governorship because he turned down, from what we can find in archaeology, the chance to be the Pharaoh. So Thutmosis then ends up being his half-brother. It was, you know what, it wasn't even his half-brother, because the guy that became Thutmosis III would have been in training, in regal training with Moses, and he would have been the son of one of the secondary wives of the Pharaoh. Moses wasn't even the son of the Pharaoh, so he wasn't even a half-brother, but he was raised as a half-brother. He turned it down, so he does not become Thutmosis III. Okay, and we see this in archaeology. It's really quite fascinating. But what I'm saying is, he knows that there's something special about him. He knows that God's got some plan for him. And I think that every day he's 40 years old and the clock is ticking, and I don't know what to do. And I've decided that I'm not going to be associated with the Egyptians. I've decided that I'm not going to buy into, because see, for him to become a Thutmosis, for him to become a Pharaoh, he would have been worshipped as a god. He was unwilling to be worshipped as a god. And that's what we're talking about in Hebrews when he says, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he regarded disgrace of greater value. He turned down having it made on this world for the chance to do the right thing. And he's 40 years old and he's frustrated because what's it gotten him? He's made the right decision. He's done the right things. He's turned down money and power. But what's that really gotten him? Nowhere. And what's it gotten his people? Nothing. And every day he sees them being abused, and every day he sees them being beaten. And every day, he can't do anything about it until one day, out of absolute, I am confident that this was out of sheer frustration, he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves. Now, this is a man that was trained in every kind of military hand-to-hand combat that you can imagine, being trained with the royalty. Okay? It was no big deal for him to snap the neck of an Egyptian soldier. Okay? He was over thousands of them. We know that from historical, not from biblical stuff. He sees his own people getting beaten. Inside of him, if you're following me in this story, if you follow me for 40 years or for 37 years, he's been brought up in this Egyptian household, but he still holds on to the God of his mother and father, and he declines all of the riches that go along with being a Pharaoh because he refuses to be worshipped like a Pharaoh was, and yet he doesn't know what to do. And there's all this tension and there's all this frustration building up inside of him. And he sees one of his own kinsmen, his own countrymen being abused, and he just snapped. And he killed the guy. Okay? Then he has to run for his life. And so here we have a Moses that is 40 years old. He kills this Egyptian for beating this Hebrew of his own bloodline. And he goes to Midian. He goes to Midian because he doesn't know where he's going to go. This is not planned. And he has basically whatever he can take with him. And he comes to a well in Midian, or Media, and you got to understand, wells in those days were very, very precious because water in the desert was very, very precious. So generally speaking, what you would do, it's not a well like you have behind your great-grandma's house with a bucket on a rope and a little thing that you spin the handle and the rope goes down and then you spin the handle and the rope comes up with water. That's not what it looked like, okay? It was rock-lined cisterns, a lot of times quite large, and they would roll huge rocks over the mouth of the well, because if you didn't, other nations or whatever could come in and poison the entire water supply by pouring stuff into your cistern. The second thing is, you didn't want all of your water being used up by other people. Then you come to get water to water your flock or your animals or your household, and there's no water in there. So they put these huge rocks so that you had to have 6 or 8 people to move the rock. Okay, so we have these 7 sisters come out and evidently they all come out together so that all 7 of them together can possibly roll the rock back because it takes a bunch of people. And instead, these shepherds come up and they say, "Ha, the rock's gone," and they start trying to steal the water. So, and we don't know how many shepherds there were, but they were enough to have run off the 7 sisters who were strong enough to roll back the rock. So we're assuming there's several of them. So Moses just goes all Billy Jack on them, okay? All of them, by himself. He's trained in this stuff. This is a piece of cake for him. And so he takes care of the shepherds so much, so he doesn't just, I don't know if he runs them off, I don't know, it doesn't say that he kills them, but he runs them off enough to where they don't come back. They don't want no more of that. And he helps the girls water their flocks. Then he ends up marrying one of them, okay? And it ends up that these girls come from the high priest in the land. So he ends up married. So here we have this highly educated, military trained governor of Egypt living in a desert. What a waste. Think about that. What a waste. And he found a wife and he raised 2 kids and he was part of a respectable household. His father-in-law was the priest and that kind of thing. But I have to wonder if Moses didn't have flashbacks, if you will. Did he remember those dreams that he used to have of being something great? Did he lay awake at night, some nights, in a tent, in his middle age, in the middle of a desert, going, what have I done? Have you ever thought about the fact, because see, we see these patriarchs in the Bible, and this is what stops us from trying to be like them. We see these patriarchs in the Bible as these great, strong men of God who can do mighty works. And we don't even aspire to that. We don't see ourselves as mighty anything. We see ourselves as losers a lot of times. We see ourselves as failures. I fail at the little stuff. God will never use me for big stuff. And because we don't see ourselves as being the ability to be used mightily of God, we never aspire to be used mightily of God. And because we see people in the Bible who we gloss over their failures and we hold them up on a pedestal, we don't ever try to be like them. I'm telling you, Moses is 40 years old, living in a desert in a tent with whatever clothes he had on his back, keeping stinky sheep all day. And I'm betting you that at night he's laying on the sand going, what have I done? God had big plans for me. I really think He did. I turned down all of the riches of Egypt because I just knew somehow that God had big plans for me. He had some purpose for me in life, and now I've blown it. I can't go back. Have you ever, be honest, have you ever read the story of Moses and even considered the fact that he felt like a failure? I guarantee you he felt like a failure. His chance was blown. He knew, we saw in Hebrews, he knew that God had plans for him, and he blew it. I mean, it started out with good motives. He was wanting to do something great. He was wanting to protect his people. He was wanting to do the right thing. But then, and this is important, and you could almost preach this point as a sermon of its own. Although his intentions were good, he took matters into his own hands. God never told him to kill that Egyptian. So when he took matters into his own hands, now he has to live with the consequences of those decisions. He has to live with the regret. Some of you in here are living with regrets. Some of you in here feel like God cannot use you mightily because you've screwed up too much. Not too many of you have killed an Egyptian. Not too many of you have murdered anybody. But you somehow, Satan has got you convinced that you have failed enough to where God can't use you. If only I had started living for Christ at a younger age. Man, if I just wouldn't have made so many bad decisions, God could use me, but it's too late now. Oh, if I'd have just prayed about who I should have married, maybe I wouldn't be in this mess. If I'd have just asked God what school to go to, that is not the time to poke somebody in the ribs, I'm just saying. If only, hey listen, there's people who feel like that they are held back. God can no longer use them because of what school they went to or the decisions they've made or who they married or whatever. The problem is you feel like you have messed up too much for God to use you. But the fascinating thing about this story is that God didn't leave Moses in the desert. God didn't say to Moses, you made a mistake, done with you. And churches, I don't want to chase too much of a rabbit on this, but there are people who are divorced, and for whatever reason in our Western culture, that churches make you feel like you are second rate. You are not second rate. That is no more of a mistake than any other of the mistakes. It's no more of a sin than any other sin. It is not the unpardonable sin, and it is not the problem that churches and religion make it out to be. But if it's not divorce, it's something else. Something else has got you convinced that God can't use you. But He can. But here's the funny thing that you gotta look at when you're looking at this story. God could have delivered Moses from that desert right away. He could have pulled Moses. He could have told Moses, "Hey, listen, I want you to lead my people out. Yeah, I killed the guy. Don't worry about that. I can take care of that. But you don't understand, God. I killed an Egyptian, so they're like looking for me. There's like a bounty on my head, you know." And God says, "Throw your stick down." He throws his stick down. It turns into a snake. He goes, "Ah!" He goes, "Pick it back up." And he picks it back up and it turns it back into a stick again. He goes, "If I can turn your staff into a snake, don't you think I can take care of the bounty that's on your head?" "Sure, God." "Then get back to Egypt. We got work to do." But that's not what He did. He left Moses in the desert for 40 years. 40 years, I bet you, Moses questioned how bad he had screwed up. For 40 years, I bet you, Moses second-guessed his mistake. For 40 years, I bet you that Moses was thinking that because I killed a man, God can't use me anymore. And God could have called him out at any time, but He didn't. And the reason is, and I'm convinced of this, God was not mad at Moses. He was giving him wilderness training. Moses had a huge job ahead of him. He was going to lead 2 to 3 million people through a wilderness to the Promised Land. And although he had all kinds of training in his Egyptian background, God was sending him through the survival skills that he did not learn in the palaces of Egypt. He's going to learn how to take care of animals in the desert. He had slaves for that. He didn't have to do that. That wasn't part of palace training in Egypt. He was going to learn where all the oases were. He was going to learn how to dig for water. He was going to learn how to find vegetation to feed animals. He was going to find out. He's going to find out where the Wadi Wati is. He was going to find out where the passes were. He was going to find out. He was going to learn the lay of the land. He's keeping sheep. He's moving all over the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. He knew that place like the back of his hand, because God had him in wilderness training. Now, the reason this is important that's cute. And I lost all of you on that one too. The reason this is important is because this affects both Christians and both believers and unbelievers. Okay? With Christians, the way that we understand God is often based around the fact of what His actions look like. So if God is doing stuff that we don't understand, then we begin to doubt. If God's got us in wilderness training like He did Moses, then we begin to think like Moses probably did, "I've done too much, I've messed up too much, this is my punishment, this is the best it's ever going to get, God can't use me now. I blew it." And so we spend so much of our time and so much of our life trying to figure out why bad things happen to good people. And we're so worried about of getting out of the circumstances that we're in. We're so worried about the fact that our life is not the way that we thought it was going to be. How many of you, don't raise your hand, how many of you have got to 40 years old or 30 years old and go, "I thought I'd have been better off by now. I thought I would have accomplished more by now. Yeah, this is really not the life that I ordered. I thought I would have been further along by now." And we're so focused on our station in life. We're so focused on how much comfort we have, or how much money we have, or notoriety we have, that we begin to discount God, because obviously if I'm in this place in my life, then God can't use me. I've blown it too much. I've failed too much. I'm divorced. I'm finished. God can't do anything with me anymore. Nonsense. That's how it affects believers. For unbelievers, here's what they say. And you need to know this. You need to understand this, because part of what I'm teaching is I want to educate my believers And I want us to be able to reach unbelievers. And unbelievers will look at this same situation, the exact same situation that the Christians are looking at, and they'll say, how can God be a loving God if He allows this kind of stuff to happen? How can God be all-powerful if He doesn't just fix everything? And they will use that as an excuse to not believe in God. So we've got a wilderness training experience that God is using. He's not even mad at Moses. He's taking him through wilderness training. And yet believers will look at the wilderness training in their lives and feel like God's abandoned them, or God's mad at them, or He's not ever going to be able to use them again. And unbelievers are going to say, what kind of God is that? If that's the kind of God He is, I don't want to worship Him. Because they're only looking for a God that fixes everything. They're not actually even looking for God. They're looking for Santa Claus. Okay, something's going to give them whatever they want and fix everything. So they look at bad situations and they say, well, what kind of God is that? So this same type of scenario works for both believers and unbelievers. So we're going to look tonight at what this wilderness training looks like, because it is a necessary part. I need you to hear me. This is a necessary part of the spiritual maturity process as Christ trains you for a higher calling. I do not know anyone that is being used of God in a small way or a mighty way that hasn't gone through wilderness training. I think of David, I think of Joseph, I think of Moses, I think of a lot of other examples in the Bible where great men of God had to go through great training. And the more training He puts you through, the more He can use you for. Okay? Now the reason that this is important to me, and this is the reason that it's important to you, is 2015 is the year of hope. Okay? And God, I was praying through this and I was trying to ask God what to do with this, and this is what He told me about hardship. When you have hardship in your life, if you have hope during the hardship, then it equals purpose. In other words, if I'm going through hardship, when I was going through hardship, when I was going through my crisis of faith, when I was going through that time in my life where I had lost so much that I told you about last week, and I was at the bottom of the proverbial barrel, and I was crying out to God, as soon as He told me that He was working in my life, as soon as He told me that this is for a reason, this is for a purpose, instantly there was hope. Because hardship, with that hope, you realize there's purpose in it. I'm not just getting beat down for no reason. I'm not just going through this stinking wilderness with these stinky sheep for nothing. God's training me. Oh my word. If you can get your mind wrapped around the fact that God is preparing me for something, this is not a waste of time, then all of a sudden your life has purpose. If, however, you are going through hardship, and this is where your unbelieving friends might be, and you need to know this, if they're going through hardship, and the only thing that they might ever get out of this hardship is hardship, there's no hope in it. God's not working through their lives. They've just made crappy decisions, and until they turn to God, their crappy decisions are just going to lead to more crappy decisions. Then their hardship without hope equals despair. For my believers in here, for those that are believers that are listening to me, you're not in that situation. And the hardship that you're going through, the crisis of faith that you're going through, does not have to equal for you despair. It could equal purpose, because there's hope in it. Because you know that God sends us through wilderness for a reason, for training. Matter of fact, if we look at Matthew chapter 3, starting in verse 16, we see that as soon as Jesus was baptized, He went up out of the water. Now, Jesus didn't have to be baptized, but He hadn't sinned. He was the perfect Son of God. He went to John the Baptist and said, I need you to baptize me. And John said, are you kidding me? I'm not even worthy to take your sandals off. I'm not even worthy to untie your sandals. Okay? And Jesus said, I need you to baptize me for an example. Okay? So John baptizes him, puts him under the water, brings him up, and as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went out of the water, and at that moment, this didn't happen when I got baptized, okay? At that moment, heaven was open. He saw the Spirit, capital S, of God descend like a dove and land on him. And a voice from heaven said, This is my Son, whom I love, and with Him I am well pleased. That ends chapter 3. Chapter 4 starts with a different verse. But you understand that when this was written, it wasn't written in chapters and verses. It was written as a story. Okay, so we added the chapters and the verses so that I can say, hey guys, I want to show you something in Scripture. Go to Matthew chapter 3, verse 16, and you can go right there. I don't have to say, go to like the 12th page and go to like the 3rd paragraph on the left side and go about 16 sentences down. Okay, so we added that. This was one continuous story. So when we start chapter 4, there was no break in the story. Chapter 4 starts. Jesus is baptized. God's pleased with him. Heaven opens up. A dove comes down, lands on Jesus in front of everybody, and a voice from heaven that is unmistakably God says, "This is my Son. I love Him, and I'm so proud of Him." And then Jesus was led immediately by the Spirit, capital S, into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. I'm proud of you, son. I love you, son. And I'm going to do something that is out of character for me. I'm going to announce it in front of everybody so that all of these people can see it and hear it. I'm going to let my Spirit come down in the shape of something that they wouldn't be totally afraid of, like a dove or something, and let it land on you. I want everybody to know that I'm proud of you. Now get in the wilderness. Really? Can I dry off first? Why did he go to the wilderness? The Holy Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. Jesus that God was well pleased with. And he was sinless. He was there for a reason. He went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without food. And he was tempted not by demons, not by just by the flesh. He was tempted by Satan himself. Now, I don't have time to chase this rabbit either, but most of you have never been tempted by Satan. Okay? You think that you have, but you haven't. Satan is not omnipresent like God. He cannot be at all places at all times, and you just don't quite rate high enough for Satan to tempt you himself. He sends his demons to do that. Okay? So if you're tempted by demons, not Satan himself. Jesus was tempted by Satan himself. Because the demons, obviously, after 40 days had failed. So Satan says, forget it, I'll do it myself. And he tempts Jesus. Why is Jesus in the wilderness? God's not mad at him. He's proud of him. Why are you in a wilderness? God's not mad at you. He's proud of you. Why was Moses in a wilderness? God wasn't mad at him. He was proud of him. He was going to use him for mighty things. Why are you in a wilderness? Satan or his demons have convinced you it's because you've messed up too much. You've made bad decisions that you can't come out of. You've made just one or two bad decisions and God can't use you anymore. But the truth is, He's just as proud of you as He is His Son. He's just as proud of you as He is Moses. And none of you killed an Egyptian lately. So you might be able to run up. But you're still in the wilderness. Why? It's not because God's mad at you. You are there for a reason. Think about this. Teachers in college, teachers in high school give tests. Why? Because they hate kids. Think about it. It's got to be that. The only reason that you would give a kid a test is because they hate you. Right? Now, kids in high school actually probably think that. Hopefully in here we're a little bit smarter than that. Why do the teachers give you a test? Because they want to see you fail. That's the reason they went to teacher school all those years, so that they could have the opportunities to see you fail. Right? Why do the teachers give you tests? Teachers give you tests because you need to know what areas you're good, and you need to know what areas you still need work. The teacher needs to know what areas you got it and what areas you ain't got it. But the purpose of a test is never to fail the student. Students fail. But the purpose of the test is never to tear you down, but it's to strengthen you. The purpose of the test is to prepare you and show you where you're strong and where you still might need work. But it is always to prepare you for a higher calling and purpose. Let that just soak in for just a minute. Why, if God loves you, would He allow you to be in a wilderness experience? Why, if He loved Moses, would He allow Moses to be in a wilderness experience? If He loves us, why don't He just bail us out? Why don't He just fix it all for crying out loud? Because He's testing us. And if He's testing us, He trusts us. You don't waste a test on somebody you don't trust. You don't waste a test on somebody that you know that they ain't going to pass. Because the purpose of the test is not to see somebody fail. It's to show them where they're strong and show them where they're weak. But it is always to prepare them for a higher calling and a higher purpose. So this is going to be your governing theological principle. This is your GTP. A test is never to tear you down, but to strengthen you, to prepare you, to show you where you're strong, show you where you need to work. But it's always to help you and prepare you for a higher calling and a higher purpose. See, I think that we look at these people in the Bible like David and Joseph and Moses and that kind of thing. And we realize that they went through some kind of training, but when it comes to us, we don't want to go through the training. We know that they're mighty men of God, and we kind of want to be mighty men of God, but we say, well, I don't want to go through the training. Okay? Perhaps, and this is probably even more dangerous, is perhaps we assume that these guys were born great. If you're honest with yourself, and a lot of people that I talk to, we assume that these great men of God were born great. The truth is, they weren't born great. They were made great. They were obedient. They were willing to go through the test. They were willing to go through the school. They were willing to do whatever it took to learn whatever they need to learn. But they weren't born great. God made them great. I'll give you an example. Everybody in here knows about Navy SEALs. Okay, everybody respects the Navy SEALs because they're like the elite of the elite. Okay, I've done a lot of reading about the Navy SEALs and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was I was reading about their training. It actually takes about a year and a half to train a SEAL, and then once you make it, there's another year of training after that in some sort of a specialty. So it's like 2.5 years. But all we hear about is what's called the BUDS training, and the BUDS training is 21 weeks. It's 3 divisions of 7 weeks that you have to go through, and during the first phase, the first 3 weeks of training is called Hell Week. Okay, and during Hell Week, you're allowed, over the span of 5 days, you're allowed about 4 hours of sleep. Okay, you're deprived of food, you're deprived of warmth, you're deprived of comfort. You are swimming in the ocean. You're doing all kinds of just unhuman stuff, it seems. Okay, but here's the thing that's fascinating about Navy SEALs, that I have read the books and the stories and the accounts from the Navy SEALs, and this is what they say. These are the guys that actually made it. They said it is rarely ever the biggest, the strongest, the smartest, or the best swimmers that make Navy SEALs. We have these guys come in and they think they got it. Because I'm huge, and I'm strong, or I can outswim all of you, or whatever the case is. He said those are never the guys that make it. Out of 1,000 guys that apply every year, and you have to really go through a process before you even get to be one of the 1,000 that apply, only 250 of them make it. And the 250 that make it, he said, are rarely ever the biggest or the strongest or the fastest of the group. They are the ones that have such determination in their spirit that they would rather die than ring the bell. There's always a bell. And during Hell Week, all you have to do to go home is ring the bell. while you are sleep deprived and worn out and being going out into the ocean to swim until you cannot swim anymore, and then they drag you up on the beach and they roll you in the sand just to make you more miserable. All the time they're screaming at you, ring the bell! Ring the bell, and we got hot coffee and donuts waiting on you. All you have to do is ring the bell. There's hot food waiting on you. You haven't had any in days. We've got food waiting on you. All you have to do is ring the bell. And you know what? Sometimes it's the strongest, it's the fastest, it's the best swimmers that ring the bell. It's the few that would rather die than fail that won't ring the bell. Why does the Navy do that? Is it because the Navy hates them? Is it because the Navy is mad at them? Is it because they have failed so much in the past that somehow Navy SEAL training is their punishment? Because when you go through a wilderness, when you go through a test, that's the first thing that pops into your mind is that God's mad at you. That He must be done with you, that He's upset with you. But if you begin to understand that this is a test, and you don't have to be the strongest, you don't have to be the fastest, you don't have to be the smartest, you have to be the one that says, I would rather follow God and die than to ring the bell. You have to have that kind of determination. Like Moses had when he said, I would rather die than to take on all the riches of Egypt. I would rather do the will of God than to be the king and have it made. That means if you're in training, God still sees something in you that He can use mightily. And it doesn't matter if you created your own wilderness or not. It doesn't matter if you're the reason that you're in the wilderness. Moses was in the wilderness because he made a mistake. God still trained him there and used him mightily. And this training, and this is the hardest part of all, and I'm really not going to be able to get into it tonight. I just don't have the time. God's training is not something that you should fear or even try to avoid. When you begin to understand that God is teaching you something, when the reason that you're in this test and the reason that you're in this wilderness is because God is preparing you for something greater, then you don't have to fear the test. You don't have to know what the outcome is. You just trust God that He's testing you for a reason. He is not going to allow you to take on more than you can handle. He won't push you beyond. They don't ever let Navy SEALs drown. Navy SEALs think they're going to drown. Navy SEALs take on a bunch of water because they almost drowned. But they never let them drown. They push them to the edge of their ability because they're pushing them for a job that's special down the road. The harder God's pushing you, the harder your wilderness is, the harder God's pushing you for something special that's coming up in your life. And if you realize that, if you realize, man, this is the final exam, this test is hard. This is harder than I ever thought it would be. I never thought I would see myself in this position. When you realize how hard your test is, you begin to realize that it's for a reason, that it's for a purpose. There's hope in that. And then once God showed me, and we talked about this example a little bit last week, once I realized that there was purpose in this test, that God wasn't mad at me, He wasn't upset with me, He was preparing me for something greater, I no longer dreaded the test. And I was determined not to ring the bell. I was determined not to let Satan win. once I realized that this was not just hopelessness, this didn't just happen to me, this wasn't a result of God being upset with me, once I realized that there was a test and a purpose and that God was preparing me for something greater, my intensity, my desire to not ring out was even stronger. And I'm telling you, folks, I'm not the smartest one in this room. I'm certainly not the strongest one in this room. I'm not the best swimmer in this room. I'm not the best anything in this room. I don't even know more Bible verses than you guys know. I'm not special. But I'm telling you, God sent me through Hell Week. And I would rather die than ring the bell. That's the reason He's got me in front of you teaching. That's the reason that He has allowed me the privilege and the honor of starting Laugh. Is because I went through my wilderness training, and instead of breaking me down, it built me up. And the only way, the turning point for me, because I was despondent and I was mad and I was fussing at God and I was saying, if this is the best you got for me, what kind of a God are you? And what kind of a God would make me go through all this? And blah, blah, blah. The turning point for me was when He said, this is a test. I'll tell you the story that He told me, because my wife used to homeschool the kids, and I'll end on this. This is the example He gave me. Every day I was complaining, I was whining, I was miserable in the test, in the wilderness that I was in. I had lost so much money, I'd lost so much friends, I'd lost all the respect of the people around me. I was constantly getting phone calls, I was badgered all day long, I was beaten down. My marriage was a wreck. Everything in my life was falling apart. So I told you last week, to the point that I wouldn't even tell anybody I was a Christian because I was afraid I was a black eye to God. I knew that I was still going to go to heaven, but I wasn't about to tell anybody I was a Christian because I didn't want to run God in the ground. That's how low. The turning point for me was one morning He says, because my wife homeschooled our kids, and He said, when Kathy gives the kids a test, He says, is it because she's mad at them? I said, no. He says, is it because she don't like them? I said, no. He said, then why does she give them a test? I said, well, because she needs to know what they've learned and what they haven't. And the kids need to know where they're good and where they still need to work. And he goes, does she ever leave the room while they're taking the test? And I said, no. He said, then let me tell you this. I know you're upset. And I know you don't understand. And I know you're hurt. But this is a test. And I don't test people that I don't think will pass. But I can tell you this. I've never left the room. That one example took me from despair to purpose. The situation never changed. But the hope did. And my situation plus hope gave me purpose. Prior to that, my situation and the lack of hope just made me have despair. God has some of you in a test. Some of you are working right beside people who are in a test. And you need to tell them this story. Some of you are in a test and you need to hear this story. Because God loves you. And He's got plans for you. But He cannot send you on a mission until He's prepared you and tested you. The question tonight, are you going to ring out? Are you going to give up and eat donuts and hot coffee with the instructors? Or are you going to see the test for what it is and determine inside of you, I would rather die than let Satan win. I would rather die than ring out. I'll leave you with that.